Why, hello, welcome to the Theology Pugcast. It's great to have you here for this episode. And it's been a little odd this summer for us. We were together for like a week and a half and saw each other all the time. And then it's been kind of spotty since then, at least for me. I haven't seen you guys as much as we normally see each other. But anyway, good to see you guys. In case you're wondering who I am, I'm C.R. Wiley. I'm a pastor. I serve a church in the Pacific Northwest, and I'm a senior editor for Touchstone Magazine. How about you, Glenn?
I'm Glenn Sunshine. I'm a senior fellow at the Colson Center for Christian Worldview. I work for Reflections Ministries. I have my own ministry, Every Square Inch Ministries. And in a previous life, I was a history professor at Central Connecticut State University.
All right. Tom?
I'm Tom Price. I teach theology, philosophy, Christian ethics, and a host of other things. One of the places is Gordon Conwell Theological Seminary.
All right. Well, we're back to talking about things we want to talk about. We've had a number of interviews this summer, both interviews of people that we got to spend some time with when we were in Oxford, but also back here in the States. But it's just us today, and the lot fell to me to pick a subject to talk about. And in light of the fact that we live in a moment of time where there's a lot of anomie and there's just a lot of anxiety about what's coming down the road and so forth, I was inspired to take an article that I read in Unherd and present that as a subject for consideration and reflection today. The title of the article is The Grisly Truth About the West. And the subtitle is We Have Forgotten Basic Principles of Civilization. And the author is a fellow by the name of Jacob Howland. Now, Unherd is I think, a worthwhile publication to visit occasionally. It's made up of heterodox writers. Maybe that is misleading. Heterodox in the sense that they're not woke. They're actually very, I think, orthodox in the sense that they're in touch with the taproots of our civilization. But in terms of what's going on in the world today, many of the people who write for Unherd are thought of as being just extreme, I guess. Anyway, this particular article caught my attention because, well, for one thing, it's a reflection on a documentary, in fact, by Werner Herzog. And Werner Herzog is a great film producer, pretty interesting guy, and worth reflecting on in terms of just, how he goes about his work and how he picks his subjects and how he goes about making films and stuff. But also a reflection on really the deep understanding that we can derive about what it takes to have a civilization and a community, just generally speaking, that works when we look at the history of thought and literature and even mythology in the West. So all of that comes together in this article, and we've all had a chance to read it a bit. And I thought we could kind of just walk through the article a little bit, but I wanted to begin with just giving you guys a chance to maybe spout off a little bit in terms of what maybe came to mind when you read it.
Well, I think for me, one of the first things that came to mind, and I'd mentioned this, he goes eventually to the Bacchae, an ancient Greek tragedy, and the connection to the opening ceremony in the Olympics was an immediate connection in my mind at that point. But overall, what you see in the article, it seems to me, is a reflection on the notion of queering in the culture. Jonathan Pageau had a really good brief commentary on the Olympic opening ceremony where he talked about this. And the issue of queering fundamentally involves the breaking down of barriers What it says is that the distinctions that we make in society need to be obliterated. All kinds of definitions, hierarchies, binaries, all of these things need to be broken down and eliminated. We think of it, first of all, in terms of the distinction between male and female in sexuality, but queering goes way beyond that. Thus, eliminating borders is queering. We're queering the nation. We are eliminating the distinction between citizen and non-citizen. We're eliminating distinctions between nations. All of these kinds of things, and that theme, it seems to me, is, we can talk about perhaps the Olympic opening ceremony in connection with this as well, but that theme, it seems to me, is one of the key things that he's talking about here, even though he doesn't use that kind of language, because what we're seeing in this article is an examination of the breakdown of the distinction between civilization and non-civilization, man and animal, all kinds of things along those lines.
Yeah, I think you're exactly right, Glenn. Go ahead, Tom.
Yeah, Glenn, you hit a key point. I think this is something long overdue in terms of discussion. But this notion that the queering of the norms. I mean, we know where it comes from, and we've been in academia long enough to know the sources of this stuff. But it has entered the mainstream now, and that's where it gets a little bit thicker. I used to say years ago that I never thought this stuff would spill over. That was my error. I just thought it was okay. This is what we talk about in the university. The weird hat is that it has entered into the mainstream. And when it enters the mainstream, there's a different lifeblood going on. I mean, there's a different way in which you have to deal with it. You can't deal with it the same way you deal with it in an academic container. It has spilled over into the imagination of a society. So now that has become the normative drive of the sort of political class and the elites, if you will, it starts to enter into the imagination of everyone else. So at this point, with such an intense kind of program, if you will, and it's everywhere, it is. It's in workplaces. It's in everything. The queering of the norms, the making of J.D. Vance as a kind of traditionalist, a weirdo. You know what I mean? So that becomes weird rather than norm, right? This is Foucault, times 1,000, if you will. We know where it comes from. We know where its characteristics, but where does it go? And I think that's a big question. Where does it go, and what does the church do in response to it? This is not necessarily where the article goes, but this is definitely a question we have to keep, in hat.
Yeah, it does. The article doesn't go to what the church should do about it, but it certainly goes to where does it end up.
Yeah,
and what he does is, in case people aren't aware of a film that Werner Herzog produced entitled Grizzly Man. This is the stepping off point, or the entry to the subject for this reflection. And the story behind Grizzly Man is there was a fellow by the name of Timothy Treadwell. And he went into the Alaskan wilderness and hung out with grizzly bears for like 13 years, So now, but his backstory is worth reflecting on. So he was a finalist in tryouts to be part of the old sitcom Cheers. So he was an actor and a talented one, talented enough to make it to the last cuts, but he was one of the people who didn't get selected. And because of that, he had kind of a crisis that, caused him to look for a reason to live. And he decided that he would undertake the task of being a spokesman for the bears. And he went into the wilderness and spent a lot of time with those monstrous creatures, and meaning monstrous just in terms of scale, but in terms of how he his story ends monstrous also in terms of what they end up doing to him. So he, lands on the Discovery Channel, which is kind of a pseudo-educational / profit-making venture. Then you have the Late Show with David Letterman.
That's a soft way of putting it.
Yeah, it tries to be NPR, but make money. But anyway, public, PBS, I should have said. But anyway, and Herzog catches wind of this guy and goes and films him, in the wilderness. And as he's filming him, gets to know him, and Herzog is uneasy about what he sees. And in the course of his, film, when he tells the story, he gives you some insight into some really significant miscalculations and errors that this guy Treadwell makes. For one thing, Treadwell was warned by park rangers and others that what he's doing was not well grounded in reality. That it's said by some of the people who knew him, or at least one person who knew him, he behaved as though these grizzly bears were just people in bear suits. They weren't actually wild animals. And he became too familiar with them and too comfortable with them. And one day in October of 2003, he was attacked by a grizzly bear, and he and his girlfriend were killed by a grizzly bear and eaten. In fact, later on, they find the remains, half-eaten corpses in the wilderness, and
actually considerably more than half-eaten.
Yeah. So, so what you have is a situation where you've got a naive and I guess foolish person who is unable to sort of appraise the dangers that he's placed himself in. And this provides us with an occasion for reflection. What is it about this particular guy? But I think that his, what we see in his story can be kind of carried over into things that we maybe see on social media, where people walk up to bison, say in Yellowstone, and try to pet them and then get gored. And just, what is it about human beings at this point where we've failed to appreciate the real difference between civilization and the wilderness? And we assume certain things about the wild that are not necessarily the case. And why don't we see that beneath the surface there's something there that is completely inhuman or unable to relate to human beings? For example, there's a point in this account that in which there's a description of the sort of the wildness and truly alien character of these bears. When you look at them in the eyes, you can tell that there's something there that is not human and is really beyond our ability to truly appreciate in terms of its danger. This is the line: "In the blank eyes of a grizzly that Treadwell captured on video just before his death, possibly the very one that killed him and his girlfriend, Herzog sees only the overwhelming indifference of nature." The overwhelming indifference, that line, indifference of nature. Why is it that we can't truly apprehend the dangers of the wilderness and this untamed alien character to the natural world? Anyway, I present that as a subject for discussion.
I think actually we need to broaden the question.
Okay.
I want to connect it to Queers for Palestine.
Okay.
Because what you see there are people who are utterly unable to comprehend that the people that they want to see as the heroes would throw them off buildings if they had the chance.
Yeah, I think there is a very clear connection between those. Yeah, you're right.
Yeah, what they see, I mean, they make assumptions about the world that everyone is like them, and therefore everything is like them.
Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm.
So the idea of intersectionality applies, so that all oppressed people are in the same class. But one of the things that people don't get is that critical theory. This is something I talk about in a book that I have that I hope will be coming out reasonably soon. Critical theory intersects with some forms of radical environmentalism where the earth itself becomes an oppressed class.
Right.
And thus you get some kinds of radical ecologists who see what they're doing as making common cause with critical race theory, with feminism, with LGBTQ stuff, with Palestine, with all of these kinds of things. Mm-hmm. And thus, since the earth is an oppressed class, since these poor oppressed creatures out there like the grizzly bears are an oppressed class, they must, of course, be on our side.
Right.
Because all oppression is the same. I mean, I think that this is what's going on in the assumptions.
I think you're right.
That nature itself must be on our side.
But you hit on something interesting, and this is something I've been tracing a lot recently, is the way in which the Christian notion of the fall really dominates Western civilization, like it or not, one way or the other. And so, especially 17th century and the like, you have sort of Bacon, the fall. You can, maybe by divine grace, we're going to be able through the sciences to kind of undo some of the damage done and kind of retrieve something of Adam, kind of get control of things. But one of the things that you see migrate in the psychology of the West as it kind of abandons Christian orthodoxy is that this notion of the fall kind of starts to take on different character. And so the character it takes, it kind of rips it from its theological threads and kind of brings it into a different realm. And so the fall now is sort of human civilization. Let's buy into the kind of Rousseau's interpretation, right? Civilization is kind of a set of chains, right? It's something that kind of imprisons the whole human being. And so in some sense, the human being is out of touch with nature because of this kind of fall. But this is really a real shift from Christian orthodoxy to a different interpretation of what it means to fall. Here, the fall means kind of falling out of kind of the natural habitat of the way things go. And kind of pure nature, if you will, is kind of sacred and sacrosanct. But in a weird way, it isn't, because there's something about nature that's red tooth and claw, right? And so this is what, the post-Rousseauians kind of found out when they kind of tried to live his ideal. They realized that, wait a minute, nature isn't as pure as you thought it was. But we have this kind of recurrence that goes on, whether it's Greta Thunberg or whatever it is, that tries to think that if you can just get human civilization out of the way. Now, let's be fair. She's onto something, but she's not onto something. These people are onto something, but they're not onto something. They are onto something in the sense that modernity is a perversion of Christian orthodoxy. And its attempts to kind of dominate nature and bring it under its subversion in the wrong kind of dominion theology has led to a lot of bad things, right? Pollution, whatever you want to call it, the kinds of things that it has done. And a lot of times Christians think being conservative means embracing this kind of modernity that is the bad form of dominion. Whereas a proper Christian dominion is something very different. It's husbandry in the right kind of sense. And this is something that is distinguished from the kind of exploit nature as raw material with no inherent intelligibility and ends. And so I think that what happens is this naivety that nature is pure and innocent has really come through a long thread of kind of distorted Christian teaching, and has made almost creation seem like it's innocent in a bizarre way, without recognizing the fall. But once the fall gets recognized, it almost seems like civilization is always a bad thing rather than a good thing. And so Christianity has to kind of deal with those kind of, that kind of thickness.
Now, your comment about husbandry and so on reminds me of a quote from Calvin that I think I've mentioned before on one of our shows. That Calvin is frequently blamed for ecological degradation and all that sort of thing. But if you read his commentary on Genesis, he talks about how it is our responsibility to take care of our land and to pass it down to the next generation, at least as well cultivated, and if possible, better cultivated than we receive it.
Absolutely,
so he has a very clear concept of the importance of stewardship and the importance of protecting the garden as we tend it, not exploiting it.
Yeah.
And I think that this is really the historic Christian position that's gotten distorted, really primarily with the Industrial Revolution. It didn't really exist much prior to that.
Yeah.
I'd like to visit this idea of the fragile wilderness for a moment, because I think it's one of the ways that we misread the Bible. And I think, for example, I've been, as you guys know, thinking a lot about Anthony of the Desert. And one of the ways that modern people misread Anthony is they assume that he's retreating into the wilderness, that the wilderness is this place where you go to get closer to God, but that's not the case, as you guys know. The wilderness is where Jesus is led to be tempted.
Yeah.
And the wilderness is a place where you are judged. And one of the things that you see over and over again in Anthony, as you read Life of Anthony by Athanasius, is that's the way Anthony thought of it. He didn't think of it as a way to get closer to God. He thought of it as a way to fight demonic powers. So he was going out to wrestle with evil spirits. That's how he saw. In fact, when he went out initially, he didn't actually go out to the desert. He went into the tombs. So his first experience in solitude was actually living in a graveyard.
Yeah. In a sense, Anthony's just following through what a literal reading of our baptismal liturgy says.
Yeah.
I mean, really, that you're going to war with these demonic powers.
So this is something that's been lost on us because and to complicate things, now we think of the wilderness as fragile and endangered, rather than seeing ourselves as under threat from the wilderness. We think of the wilderness as being something that's threatened by us. And so this guy, Treadwell, goes into the wilderness to save the bears, somebody would go out to save the whales or save the seals or something like that. He thought of himself in that way and ends up being consumed by the thing that he thought he was going to save. But just broadly speaking, this also fails to appreciate, the fallen character of human beings and the wildness that is been restrained by the standards of civilization. And that's where this essay eventually goes. The story of Treadwell and his experience with the bears is intended to be a stepping off point to this other matter, which is what we've been talking about as well, this Bacchanalia, this sort of this celebration of getting rid of the boundaries. And this all ties together because we're naive about nature. We're naive about the fallen character of things. We're naive about the dangers that surround us. And we're naive about the boundaries and what they serve. So we think of the boundaries as you noted earlier, Tom, chains, things that keep us from being who we truly are and all that kind of stuff, when in fact they're restraining things.
Chris, here's an interesting kind of thing to throw in there, because there is this kind of thread. You see it all the time. I see it in my own life. I have animals, animals that can be domesticated. I mean, almost related to intelligibly, which is wild. I have cats, you know.
I thought you said you had animals that were domesticated.
Yeah, they're domesticated. That's an interesting conversation because a lot of people will see that imposing a kind of centric vision onto the created reality, where you could also read it as a way in which of healing the brokenness that happened with the fall. And so there are two things going on here, two tensions. So whereas I have I just got a recent kitten, an all boy cat. I mean, he's so boy, he's a hunter. He'll cut your eyes out if you don't watch him. He's that. But on the other hand, he's the sweetest communicative creature I've ever met in my life. How do you get that? How do you deal with a non-human creature that is grisly on one side, but also communicative to a domesticated situation on the other? This is totally different than Rousseau or,
and that's exactly where the author goes in this article. By taking us to Euripides and Bacchae. So I'll read some portions from that, but I can tell that Glenn has something he wants to add here.
Well, two things here. First of all, I question whether cats are actually domesticated.
I have some good ones.
But I actually wrote in a blog post years ago in a blog that I'm not sure I still have access to. It was called Echoes of Eden, in which I was reflecting on pets. Mm-hmm. There was a Chinese woman who visited our house, and she said she could not understand the American thing about keeping animals in the house. She just found this the strangest thing in the world.
Right.
And my argument was that essentially pets for us are a sort of an ancestral memory of what things were like in Eden.
Yeah.
And it is also pointing ahead to our hope of the peaceable kingdom, where we will once again be living in real harmony with animals and things like that in the world. I think that there's a profound theological element to domestication.
But there is also there is a redemptive dimension too, because I see stuff all the time where a cat that normatively would kill a mouse becomes a friend to it. That is the bizarrest thing. And that isn't just like a lot of human cultivation. This sometimes happens very naturally. And this is so against kind of the bear attacking, like Chris is talking about, kind of you're running through the woods and all of a sudden you stumble upon a bear. That's not often a good thing, even for a human being. But on the other hand, the fact that some of these relationships become reconciled attests to something very profound and very contra a lot of the narratives that only speak of kind of the violence and the discord at the heart of reality.
But this is where Euripides goes. So Euripides is getting at this. Well, in fact, let me just go ahead and read a paragraph or two from the article, and we can reflect on it. The earliest tragedies from the late 6th century BC told the story of how the cult of Dionysius, a god closely associated with nature, came from Asia to conquer the Greek cities. So this is an interesting thought. I was unaware that Dionysius was an import. Euripides' Bacchae, one of the last great tragedies, covered the same ground. In Bacchae, Dionysius avenges himself on the rulers of his native city Thebes, who deny his divinity. In doing so, he lives up to his reputation of being the absolute other, a paradoxical god who scrambles all that should be separated and defies the laws of logic. An immortal who appears in the disguise of a young man, Dionysius is, in effect, a grizzly bear in a human costume. He is ambiguously masculine and feminine, Theban and foreign, Greek and barbarian, tame and wild. Present everywhere, yet nowhere, he is sober, cruel, and, like nature itself, most terrible, yet most gentle to mankind. And by the end of the play, the complete collapse of the civilizational matrix is visible on stage, where the palace lies in ruins, and the mother of the young King Pentheus cradles his decapitated head. But this gets to this. So, like I've heard it noted that the Nazis were sentimentalists. They weren't cruelly unfeeling. The pathway to their cruelty came through their sentimentality.
Yeah, that romanticism became sickly in German thinking and culture. Yeah.
So let me go on and read the next paragraph, because I think this is helpful in terms of this author's reflections. The Bacchae exposes the darkest depths of the human psyche, where tenderness is inseparable from viciousness. For it is the Theban women, led by Pentheus's mother, who tear him limb from limb. They do this not as Bacchantes, peaceful celebrants of Dionysius, who had early nestled gazelles and young wolves in their arms, suckling them, but on a wild mountainside, but as Maeads, from the Greek mania, furious destroyers of human worlds. And the play's true horror derives from the women's instantaneous transition between these two seemingly opposed modes of being, one Edenic and pastoral, the other homicidically insane. So when we think about civilization in light of that, this is a pre-Christian assessment of the natural world. And civilization then is holding back, restraining these forces, tempering both, the cruel and the sentimentalist themes, and saying that we do need standards, we do need distinctions, we do need to make we need to acknowledge the differences between men and women, for example, or between the wild and civilization. And civilization is something that we need to defend, because it defends us.
Just a quick note. You'll notice that the definition or the description they gave of Dionysus there was effectively queer. The definition, by the definition that we used before.
Right.
I mean, which is again what they were doing in the Olympics, but that's we might not want to go there at this point, but it's the breaking down of all distinctions.
Right.
It's also worth noting, I think it's in Prince Caspian, Bacchus shows up.
Yeah.
And one of the girls says, I wouldn't really feel safe around him if Aslan wasn't here.
Yeah.
And this is affirmed very strongly. And the reason is because the women who are frolicking around him can turn into Maenads very, very quickly.
Yeah.
Apart from Aslan.
Sure. There's another scene, of course, in The Wind in the Willows, where Pan they come upon Pan. They're looking for a little lost otter, if I remember correctly. So it's Rat and Mole who are out, and they're looking for this lost otter. And they find him eventually, but he's been found first by Pan and protected by Pan. And it's a beautiful scene. I mean, there's a sense in which Pan becomes a personification of the holy in that story, and it's a very luminous passage. It's one of my favorite passages in children's literature. Yet there's something untamed, obviously dangerous about Pan, even in that account. And when we think about like Tom Bombadil and Goldberry is clearly inspired, is sort of inspired by Waterfay. Her connection to the river, the Withywindle, and to water in general. And if you recall, in the Adventures of Tom Bombadil, she pulls Tom into the water. And that, by the way, is something that Waterfay were believed to do, to drown people, just kind of because it, amused them. Who knows? But Tom tames her. He claims her and tames her and brings her home and domesticates her. So what you have in Goldberry is you could say, a redeemed fae. But before things are redeemed, they're dangerous and cruel and unpredictable.
Well, there is, this, speaks a lot so much of the nature of creation itself as a kind of plenitude. It has all this capacity within it, this potential, the way Aquinas would talk about it, that can be realized. And it also speaks of human beings as kind of agents that are allowed to kind of actualize a lot of that potential, right? Take the things that the powers, like Chris was talking about, these kind of latent powers that are sitting under the surface, and they're able to kind of unleash themselves because they are a real power and a real force to contend with. Creation has that in it. This is one of its dangers, but also one of its gifts, right? The capacity to kind of be this kind of reflection of God's power, but on the flip side, be a distortion of it, right? It's just like dominion. It can be a good thing, kind of, ordering thing towards the gifts that are given, or kind of become a dominance in the wrong sense of the word. And you have all this under the surface, floating and ready to be kind of driven. And then you have these kind of bad drivers, right? These ones that have the capacity to do something with it, but they don't do with it the right thing, but the wrong thing. And they unleash forces, right? And this is kind of what you could often talk of the modern world without its proper Christian limits, kind of unleashes a set of forces that are there in the creation that allow it to kind of unhinge. But then the natural world itself has been given over to this in a way, the way in which red tooth and claw is the norm. And so if you match it in the human realm with the natural realm without Christian redemption, you've unleashed a very bad set of conditions that have a lot of undermining power and capacity, which otherwise oriented the flip side would be creative, culture building, civilization building, and kingdom oriented. And so you have these kind of things in tension with each other. And what happens with that tension is that when the Christian kind of vision gets marginalized, the other vision gets sort of accented. And so that's where we sort of are, that the red truth and claw and the way in containing it is, if we don't have a Christian set of containers, where do we go?
Yeah. I think the French Revolution is an example of this. But I also think that the Democratic National Convention or Black Lives Matter is kind of this. So because what you have is this weird kind of schizophrenia with people on the left. So on the one hand, it's perfectly fine when a bunch of folks burn down their city, in the name of liberation or justice or what have you. But then when it comes time to actually have to pull off a business meeting like the Democratic National Convention, you no longer say things like defund the police. You say, let's get as many police officers as we possibly can in here to make sure that these rioters don't disrupt the meeting.
But that's an interesting point. So how does order function when ripped from its theological threads to serve a kind of political economy that benefits from it, but not in a serious way, but only in a power gaining way? Because this isn't really far removed from the red tooth and claw world that we're talking about with the grizzly.
Yeah, right. Yeah, go ahead, Glenn.
Quick etymological note here.
Yeah.
Pan, you talked about the plenitude in nature.
Yeah.
Pan is the Greek word for all things. It's a neuter. It's a neuter version of the word for all.
Yeah.
And it is so. Pan is the god of sort of all things out there in nature, and it is also the root word of our word panic.
Right.
Panic is
Right.
associated with Pan.
Right. Right.
So
Yeah.
that's actually a rather interesting
Yeah.
connection to Greek mythology, to the kinds of things that you're talking about.
And even when kind of a Christianized use of the word pan was pandemonium, devils everywhere.
All the demons.
Yeah. So let me read a little more, because this is such rich stuff. And by the way, we'll link this in the show notes. But, this guy just goes into some things in ways that is just really unusual to see people do today. So Grizzly Man, in its essential respects, a postmodern reprise of the Bacchae. In one scene, a seaplane pilot remembers the horror that awaited him when he arrived to fly Treadwell and his girlfriend out of the wilderness. As a thick swarm of flies and mosquitoes buzzed around him, the pilot recalls finding what was left of Tim's body, his head, and a little bit of backbone attached. He found a hand, arm, wristwatch still attached. Treadwell's grisly end makes his very name sound like a warning. One is reminded of Pentheus's murder, when crazed females shout in triumph while he shrieks in terror. One tore off an arm, another a foot, still warm in the shoe. This, Euripides suggests, is what happens when fundamental differences are erased and clear thinking gives way to liable, to libial sentiment and emotion. Dionysius, the god of wine and intoxication, a modern dress production of the Bacchae, might well make him a grungy, long-haired, androgynous hippie from the 60s, wearing bell-bottom jeans and an army jacket with a painted peace symbol, handing out psychedelic drugs that induce pleasant highs followed by nightmares. The era of communes and make love not war, after all, was also a time of murder and mayhem. Who can forget the Manson family cult, or the wild-eyed lunacy of its leader? Freed from long-standing social constraints, raw feeling reveals itself to be a heaving sea of chaos. Anyway, that's a really apt description, not just of the 60s, but of the 20s of the 21st century, where we find ourselves today. And what becomes of this? Where does it go? Well, there has to be a point where standards are revalorized and reinstituted and defended. But are we there yet? This gets to your question at the beginning of the show, Tom. Where are we in all of this? Are we at a place where we are ready to recover those, or do we have to live through more insanity?
It's a hard question. I think that, you do see people in the religious sphere starting to reorient themselves on what kind of the thickening of their own tradition, or kind of evaluating where in Christendom they fit in. I mean, that's been happening for a long time. I think of Tom Oden, or a figure like that, trying to start to say that the old categories of defining Christianity kind of have to take a back seat to talking about the roots of where our faith come from, and starting to create our identity from a deeper drawing from the wells of where we come from. But on the other side, you have this question that, are there parameters that become boundary points for limits that we won't tread, and identity points from which we start to, kind of recognize that we're from this, and we are a part of this, and we are committed to this. I don't think we're there yet. I don't think we know even how to ask those questions. I mean, I'm getting, and I don't mean this in a bad way, but I'm getting, and maybe it's a good thing, but I'm getting people that are not more naive and more naive entering into my undergraduate classes. And this is a telltale sign that on the one hand, they're not being indoctrinated the way I often thought they were. I was thinking they were kind of thickly indoctrinated, to where I've realized they're thinly indoctrinated. But the downside is that I think where they're catechized from those angles, I don't think they're as thickly catechized. It gives me an opportunity, but it's also a sobering point where it's like, I have to do a lot more work where I sit. There's a lot more for an academic Christian thinker to do than just give the old status quo. You have to do a lot of catechizing, forming, and shaping that wasn't there before. People don't have the categories. They work with a very thin understanding of reality. And the flip side, even in the faith, they have a very thin understanding of that. So they're very manipulatable. Technology doesn't help here when it's oriented the wrong way either. So we have a very sobering point. We're at a sobering point, I think, where we have to invest a lot more, I think, from our end, and we can't take as much for granted.
Right.
We also have another area of queering we have to deal with, and that's queering truth. The line between reality and fakes has been completely obliterated due to deep fakes and things like that. You can make a computer, make any one of us look like we're saying and doing pretty much anything.
Well, Glenn,
and so it becomes virtually impossible. Even if you see something on a video, it becomes virtually impossible to know if it's real.
Right. Glenn, you actually hit something indirectly on that point. It's this notion that there was a shift, and you want to really hit you want to tap into that place in evangelical theology where it really started to lose its center is when it embraced historicism. When you embrace the fact that things are contextually defined, you've embraced relativism at that point. And when you embrace relativism at the point, in historicism at that point, you start to recognize and acknowledge that somehow there isn't any kind of metaphysically transcending truth, essences, definitions. It's all definable by the circumstance. And because our circumstances are different, the evangelical world has started to embrace the circumstantial definition rather than the metaphysical and the transcendent definitions that classical orthodoxy held. And so therefore, it's in a state of flux. And so you don't have the same set of parameters to define the limits that we used to have, because these things are all determined by where you sit historically in light of the kinds of contingencies that are more illuminative than the metaphysical realities that classical Christianity held: God, creation, our place in it. So,
and this is why so many ostensibly Christian schools, historically evangelical schools, are in deep trouble.
Yes.
It's hard to even talk to, say, somebody at one of those schools, who teaches at one of those schools, who even has an ability to think about these matters.
Yeah.
They're so captive to the historicism and to the sort of the internal squabbles of their discipline and the fads and the movements and theory and whatever you talk about. And even the people who could, or at least historically should be the corrective, theologians, philosophers, they're as captive as anybody.
Exactly. I mean, you take a figure like a John Milbank, who has a brilliant mind, but is as historicistically determined as he is, he loses all his credibility because of that.
Yeah, I see stuff that he posts on X every once in a while, formerly Twitter. I just roll my eyes and say, you are the reason why I originally had an interest in radical orthodoxy, and you are also the reason I no longer do.
Exactly. It's one of those figures that saw something they should have run with, but they didn't run with it the right way. And the historicism is, I think, what undercut them.
So I just finished a book entitled The Fourth Turning is Here. You guys familiar with the thesis of the fourth turning? Basically the idea that there's a cycle to history and that there are kind of four phases. And according to this particular framework of thinking, we're in the winter of the West. And now we've seen it before. So the fourth turning is like a generational thing. It's not just simply kind of the end of the civilization, but there's this sort of process. And then at this point, the number of the things, according to this book and the thesis behind it, The Fourth Turning, there's a certain kind of inevitability that we can kind of use to sort of understand at the moment. But I think the thing that, whether you're talking about the fourth turning or you're talking about this particular article and kind of the breakdown or the queering of society and whether or not that has any kind of future, the problem with the people who talk in those terms, and I know we all know this, but maybe people are just not able to appreciate it, is that they really don't have a plan for making things work. They only have a plan for making things that do work not work. And if when you ask them, can you tell me how this is all going to play out, they get very magical. They don't have any kind of actual program that they're trying to sort of follow. They're basically the idea is that if we just tear everything down, all the native goodness is going to come to the surface, and it's going to be the age of Aquarius. It's just going to be marvelous. But we know that that's not the case. What ends up happening is somebody has to establish order. And here's the paradox, or the irony, I should say. The irony is that guess who has to do it? Young men. In other words, the party that is identified as being the threat to the welfare of the community actually is the party that has to save the community in the end, because force will. And this is again the irony. Everybody is sort of worried about coercive force, but in the end, coercive force is the thing that you have to employ in order to establish the order that we all need to live.
Well, it's what holds up the order as is, and I think a lot of times the people that do, the class you're talking about, don't recognize the actual power that they have, and that's politically driven and propagandized. You kind of make them feel powerless, and yet they still hold up civilization, if you will. It's one of those things. I don't know how long that lasts. I don't know how long it holds, because I think there is a kind of frailty to the kind of arrogance of current political culture that doesn't allow it to see reality the way it is, and then at some point reality has to break through. I don't know when that is.
Well, let me return to the article, because here's another, I think, helpful paragraph, and this will be the last one I quote from the article. Yet we are busily wiping away all the boundaries and borders of civilized life in a suicidal pursuit of some ill-defined vision of justice and equity. Gangs of criminals loot stores in major cities with impunity. Illegal immigrants are treated like citizens, and private citizens are surveilled like malicious foreigners. We no longer care to observe the difference between males and females. The new libertinism of drugs, pornography, and electronic amusements frees adults to remain in perpetual childhood while encouraging children prematurely to abandon their innocence. The family is collapsing because there are too few men willing to protect and nurture it as husbands and fathers, and too few women insisting that they do so. Animal liberation extremists, furry communities, trans, post, and anti-humanist philosophies, and the relentless advance of AI are progressively effacing the differences between human beings, animals, and machines. Even logic and analytical precision are now attacked as instruments of oppression. That's a mouthful, but it's a picture of the situation on the ground. And in the middle of that, he noted too few men willing to protect and nurture it as husbands and fathers. But that's precisely the group, the class of people who need to rise to the occasion. But will they be welcomed? I think if things get bad enough, they will be welcomed by the majority of people out there.
Yeah, but I think that there's something you're overlooking.
Yeah, go ahead. Go for it.
Open borders.
Yeah.
The problem with open borders, okay, we see this in spades in Britain right now. But one of the problems with open borders is that the majority of people who are crossing them aren't the families with children and things like that. It's young men who are, frankly, don't have the same ethos that is being imposed on Western societies, where they're seen as the problem. They're told to sit down and shut up and all of that kind of thing.
Yeah.
And the net result is we're importing a much more aggressive group of men while telling the Western men that they're the problem. They need to sit down, shut up, get to the back of the bus, that kind of thing.
Yeah.
So what's going to happen is, well, what we see happening in Britain right now is that native British men are, if they even raise a question about this, post something on Facebook, actually say it's okay to be white, you can be arrested for a hate crime and put in prison. It's happened.
Yeah.
Okay. But migrant gangs walking around with machetes threatening people, that's okay.
Yeah.
You violent crime committed by them, they get arrested, they get suspended sentences. This is happening. We have in America, there are Venezuelan gangs who rob gun stores and who have taken over apartment complexes in Colorado. And they're now running the places.
Yeah.
I mean, this is what happens, but with no response from the governments, because of this rather bizarre ideology that's discussed in the article and critical theory and all of those kinds of things.
There's a tension there because on the one hand, I think it is that, the people that are blamed for everything tend to play by the rules, and the rule setters are those that shut down their voices and disempower them. And I think that is really if that shifts, that's where the whole game shifts. So
the question becomes which young men are going to step up and take the lead.
Well, that's exactly it. And for a long time, like you said, penalization and all the negative deterrents have been in place politically to shut down those who otherwise would be the power drivers. Because of that, therefore, very few people are willing to kind of go put their life on the line for it. But this is something you learn with the Christian community. Once you recognize that you're going to be martyred, then you're a big threat to the rest of the system because you're not governed by fear of what they're going to take from you or steal from you or everything else. Martyrdom, in the Christian sense of the word, is the biggest political threat there ever is, because it says your power will not shut me down. Whether you take whatever you take from me, you're not going to win. And this is something that, when we look at martyrdom in the history of the church, we often think, oh, these people were the oppressed, marginalized, no, they're the seedbed of what allows Christianity to be here today, right? And it's very similar when people realize that politics is a determining power line that wants to shut people up, to when those people recognize that if they're willing to risk a lot of things in order to regain the power dimension that they're lacking, then that becomes the serious threat. I mean, I think this is what you see with, let's take a controversial issue, January 6th. Okay, let's go politically heavy on that because we recognize if that group of people actually rose up, politics would change in this country. So let's go politically heavy on this small group of people and politicize a non-event, so we can shut up and shut down anything that could actually become, if they actually recognize the power that they had, a serious threat. I mean, that's the kind of stuff we're dealing with.
Yeah, I agree with both of you guys. My comments were not intended to imply that we're there yet.
Yeah, sure.
I think that there's still a lot of stuff that needs to play out. For example, I have a personal friend who is going to prison over January 6th. He's a family man. He was completely framed by the system. He's about as dangerous as any of you or me. I mean, what I mean by that is yes, he's dangerous, but he's not dangerous in the sense that the government is justified in treating him the way they are. He was herded and I think in a very sophisticated, orchestrated way framed. I have that conviction. And yes, there are a lot of things going on right now that are intended to serve the short-term interests of certain political groups. But my thought is that if we level this scenario up one or two levels, that at that point, the illusions are no longer sustainable. And I'm afraid that's where it's headed. And a community like the one I live in here in Battleground is made up of a lot of people who generally just want to live their own lives and be left alone, and they're doing quite a good job at that. But occasionally are I think poked at and kind of like a bear. And there's going to be a point where the bear just has had it and is going to strike. Now, until that time, I think the way things are playing out, I don't see any immediate prospect that things are going to change. I do think things are going to continue along this line. Anyway, we're getting to a point where we should bring the things to a conclusion. I want to give you guys the chance to give your final thoughts before we do, though. So, Glenn, have anything you want to say as we finish up?
Oh, I think I've said altogether too much already.
How about you, Tom? Anything more?
Well, I mean, just the last point that, I mean, we're set in a set of very complicated circumstances to kind of bear out our witness. And that kind of witness is such that when you contest the kind of drives of civilization and society as it's politically driven, we're becoming increasingly against the grain. I mean, we all know this. With that said, there are aspects of us that are tied to reality that is such that what we say and commit ourselves to is something that isn't going to go away. We don't just have a meta-narrative amongst meta-narratives or narratives among narratives. We're tied to the reality vision of creation, redemption, and revelation. And because of that, we are attuned to reality in the fullest sense of the word. And so what we do when we enact our lives that way is such that we bear witness to something that the world rejects. And so that is always a conflict. It's a deep conflict with the power and their interests. But nevertheless, I think it's something that doesn't go away. And as Chris said, it's not something that's going to be eliminated just because politics doesn't like it or wants to imprison it. And so we have to learn how to psychologically deal with that set of circumstances.
Yeah, I'm with you, Tom. And that's one of the things I've been trying to explore in this book I'm working on. On, basically, the story of Anthony and some of the things that he taught us with regard to how to live in a dystopia. And anyway, thanks a lot. We'll end up on that note.
But wasn't too grim.
That's right. Too grizzly. But thank you for listening to the Theology Pugcast. We are a listener-supported show, and we appreciate all of our Patreon supporters. And if you'd like to join that intrepid band, you can do so by following the link in the show notes. We really do appreciate the things that folks have done for us in terms of their prayers and their giving in the past, and we really could use the financial support. So if you feel prompted, we want you to know that prompting might be, indigestion, or it could be God telling you to go ahead and become a supporter, because it does make a difference. Anyway, thanks a lot, and bye-bye.
Bye.
The Theology Pugcast is a ministry of Trinity Reformed Church in Huntsville, Alabama. To learn more about the church, you can visit trinityreformedkirk.com. trinityreformedkirk.com.